The morning sun was just peeking through the clouds as Captain Raj Kumar walked across the airport terminal, his black rolling suitcase clicking against the polished floor. He'd done this walk thousands of times before. 15 years of flying the same Chicago to Seattle route had made every corner of O'Hare International Airport feel like home. Stopping at his favorite coffee shop, he ordered his usual, a simple black coffee, no sugar. The barista, who knew him well, smiled and asked, "The usual morning flight, Captain?" Raj nodded, checking his watch. He always arrived 2 hours early, a habit that had served him well throughout his career. In the crew room, he met his co-pilot for today's flight. First Officer Lee was newer to the airline, having joined just 8 months ago. She carried herself with quiet confidence, but Raj could see the eagerness in her eyes. The same look he'd had when he first started flying commercial planes. As they walked through their pre-flight checklist, Raj shared little tips he'd learned over the years. "See this weather pattern?" He pointed at the radar screen. "Might look clear now, but I've seen it develop into something tricky over the Rockies. We'll keep an eye on it." Lee listened intently, jotting notes in her small handbook. The cabin crew arrived, led by the head flight attendant, Mr. Singh, who'd been flying almost as long as Raj. They discussed the passenger count, 157 today, including 3 unaccompanied minors and an elderly couple who'd requested special assistance. "Just another day at the office," Mr. Singh joked, but they all took their responsibilities seriously. In the cockpit, Raj settled into his captain's seat, the familiar smell of leather and electronics welcoming him. He'd flown this Boeing 737 so many times he could probably do it blindfolded, though he'd never tell that to the passengers. As they went through their systems check, he noticed Lee's methodical approach. Good, he preferred co-pilots who were thorough. "Flight 247, you're cleared for pushback," the ground controller's voice crackled through their headsets. Raj acknowledged, then turned to Lee. "Ready for another beautiful day in the skies?" She smiled and nodded, her hands steady on the controls. As they taxied toward the runway, Raj thought about his daughter's upcoming school play. He'd promised to be back in time to see her perform as the lead tree in her environmental awareness show. These little moments kept him grounded, even as he spent his days in the clouds. The morning rush hour traffic crawled along the highway parallel to the runway. Raj always found it amusing. While those cars would spend hours getting to work, he'd be crossing multiple states in the same time. The thought made him appreciate his job even more. "Flight 247, cleared for takeoff, runway 27 letters," the tower announced. Raj pushed the throttles forward, feeling the familiar surge of power as the massive aircraft began rolling down the runway. Beside him, Lee called out the speeds with precision. "V1, rotate." The nose lifted smoothly, and Chicago's skyline fell away beneath them. As they climbed through 10,000 feet, the seatbelt sign dinged off. The morning sun painted the clouds in brilliant shades of orange and pink. It was views like these that had made Raj fall in love with flying in the first place. He remembered his father taking him to the airport as a child, watching planes take off and land for hours. Now here he was, living that dream. Looking at his instruments, everything was perfect. The engines humming smoothly, the weather ahead looking clear, and a tailwind that would get them to Seattle right on schedule. Just another routine flight. Or so he thought. The morning sun was just peeking through the clouds as Captain Raj Kumar walked across the airport terminal, his black rolling suitcase clicking against the polished floor. He'd done this walk thousands of times before. 15 years of flying the same Chicago to Seattle route had made every corner of O'Hare International Airport feel like home. Stopping at his favorite coffee shop, he ordered his usual, a simple black coffee, no sugar. The barista, who knew him well, smiled and asked, "The usual morning flight, Captain?" Raj nodded, checking his watch. He always arrived 2 hours early, a habit that had served him well throughout his career. In the crew room, he met his co-pilot for today's flight. First Officer Lee was newer to the airline, having joined just 8 months ago. She carried herself with quiet confidence, but Raj could see the eagerness in her eyes. The same look he'd had when he first started flying commercial planes. As they walked through their pre-flight checklist, Raj shared little tips he'd learned over the years. "See this weather pattern?" He pointed at the radar screen. "Might look clear now, but I've seen it develop into something tricky over the Rockies. We'll keep an eye on it." Lee listened intently, jotting notes in her small handbook. The cabin crew arrived, led by the head flight attendant, Mr. Singh, who'd been flying almost as long as Raj. They discussed the passenger count, 157 today, including 3 unaccompanied minors and an elderly couple who'd requested special assistance. Just another day at the office, Mr. Singh joked, but they all took their responsibilities seriously. In the cockpit, Raj settled into his captain's seat, the familiar smell of leather and electronics welcoming him. He'd flown this Boeing 737 so many times he could probably do it blindfolded, though he'd never tell that to the passengers. As they went through their systems check, he noticed Lee's methodical approach. Good, he preferred co-pilots who were thorough. Flight 247, you're cleared for pushback, the ground controller's voice crackled through their headsets. Raj acknowledged, then turned to Lee. Ready for another beautiful day in the skies? She smiled and nodded, her hands steady on the controls. As they taxied toward the runway, Raj thought about his daughter's upcoming school play. He promised to be back in time to see her perform as the lead tree in her environmental awareness show. These little moments kept him grounded, even as he spent his days in the clouds. The morning rush hour traffic crawled along the highway parallel to the runway. Raj always found it amusing. While those cars would spend hours getting to work, he'd be crossing multiple states in the same time. The thought made him appreciate his job even more. Flight 247, cleared for takeoff, runway 27 letters, the tower announced. Raj pushed the throttles forward, feeling the familiar surge of power as the massive aircraft began rolling down the runway. Beside him, Lee called out the speeds with precision. V1, rotate. The nose lifted smoothly, and Chicago's skyline fell away beneath them. As they climbed through 10,000 feet, the seatbelt sign dinged off. The morning sun painted the clouds in brilliant shades of orange and pink. It was views like these that had made Raj fall in love with flying in the first place. He remembered his father taking him to the airport as a child, watching planes take off and land for hours. Now here he was, living that dream. Looking at his instruments, everything was perfect. The engines humming smoothly, the weather ahead looking clear, and a tailwind that would get them to Seattle right on schedule. Just another routine flight. Or so he thought. The next few seconds seemed to unfold in slow motion. Without any warning, Captain Raj's eyes rolled back, and his body went limp. His head fell forward, hitting the control column with a soft thud. The plane immediately responded to the unexpected input, its nose dipping slightly toward the rocky landscape below. Lee's heart jumped into her throat as she watched her captain slump unconscious. For a split second, she froze, all her years of training temporarily forgotten as the reality of the situation hit her. The weight of responsibility for 157 lives suddenly pressed down on her shoulders like a physical force. The aircraft's supple descent snapped her back to reality. Her hands moved instinctively to her controls, muscle memory from countless training sessions taking over. Captain. Captain Raj? Her voice shook slightly as she called out to him, even though she knew he couldn't respond. The radio crackled with an air traffic controller's voice asking about their slight deviation from the assigned altitude. Lee's mouth felt dry as she keyed her microphone, trying to keep her voice steady. "Stand by, Denver Center," she managed to say, knowing she needed to stabilize the aircraft before dealing with anything else. Through the cockpit window, the jagged peaks of the Rockies looked more threatening than majestic now. Light turbulence buffeted the aircraft, making her job even more challenging. A quick glance at the instruments showed they'd lost 300 feet of altitude in those few seconds of chaos. Behind her, she heard a knock on the cockpit door. Mr. Singh's voice came through the intercom, concern evident in his tone. "Everything all right in there?" He had noticed the unusual movement of the aircraft. Lee took a deep breath, knowing the next few minutes would require perfect coordination with the cabin crew. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached up to engage the autopilot. Training scenarios had never fully captured the emotional weight of a real emergency. She could feel sweat forming on her palms as she gripped the controls, her mind racing through emergency procedures that suddenly seemed jumbled. "Pan, pan, 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 pan," she finally transmitted, declaring an urgency situation to air traffic control. The words felt strange in her mouth. She'd practiced them dozens of times, but had never needed to use them for real. Denver Center, Flight 247. We have a medical emergency. The captain is unconscious. Request immediate assistance. The controller's response was immediate and professional, but Lee could hear the concern in his voice. As he began clearing other aircraft from their vicinity, she performed a quick scan of nearby airports. The nearest suitable one was still 45 minutes away, an eternity when every second counted. Mr. Singh entered the cockpit after Lee granted him access, his experienced eyes quickly assessing the situation. "I'll make an announcement for medical personnel," he said calmly, his presence helping to steady Lee's nerves. She nodded gratefully, focusing on securing the captain's unconscious form so he wouldn't inadvertently interfere with the controls. The next challenge came from the weather radar. A line of storms was developing ahead, exactly as Raj had predicted during their morning briefing. The memory of his earlier warning made Lee's throat tight. How quickly things had changed from those routine moments of pilot small talk. As Mr. Singh made a discreet call for medical assistance over the passenger announcement system, Lee could hear the murmur of concerned voices from the cabin. She forced herself to block them out, concentrating instead on the immediate tasks at hand. Running through her mental checklist, maintain aircraft control, navigate, communicate. Lee's hands gripped the controls tightly as memories of simulator training sessions flashed through her mind. But this was different, terrifyingly different. The steady beeping of instruments and the occasional burst of radio chatter seemed amplified in her heightened state of awareness. The flight manual, usually her trusted companion, now felt like a jumbled maze of procedures. "Any doctors on board?" Mr. Singh's voice echoed through the cabin again, this time with more urgency. Lee could hear movement behind her as flight attendants coordinated with passengers. Her eyes darted between the instruments and Captain Raj's still form, silently willing him to wake up. The weather radar painted an increasingly concerning picture. The storm system was intensifying, forming a wall of angry red and yellow blobs across their planned route. Under normal circumstances, navigating around weather was routine. Now, with her captain unconscious and her nerves fraying, each decision felt overwhelming. An elderly gentleman in a blue sweater appeared at the cockpit door, a doctor on vacation with his grandchildren. "I'm Dr. Patel," he said quietly, kneeling beside Captain Raj. His calm demeanor provided a stark contrast to the chaos in Lee's mind. She found herself straining to hear his medical assessment while simultaneously responding to air traffic control's questions. "Blood pressure's quite high," Dr. Patel muttered, using equipment from the plane's medical kit. The words sent a chill down Lee's spine. She remembered Raj's daughter, waiting for her father to see her school play. The thought made her hands shake slightly as she adjusted their heading to avoid a patch of turbulence. The radio crackled again. "Flight 247, be advised we're coordinating with medical services at several airports. Do you have a preferred diversion point?" The question hung in the air. Lee stared at the navigation display, the different airport options blurring before her eyes. Each choice carried consequences she'd never had to consider before. Memory fragments from training sessions flooded her mind. Always maintain aircraft control. Aviate, navigate, communicate. But they hadn't covered the feeling of utter aloneness that came with being the only conscious pilot at 36,000 feet, responsible for countless lives while weather closed in around them. A flight attendant appeared with water and emergency supplies. "Passengers are asking questions," she whispered. Some noticed the altitude change. Lee nodded, knowing they needed to keep everyone calm while dealing with this crisis. The weight of managing not just the aircraft, but also passenger anxiety, pressed down on her. The turbulence increased, making Captain Raj's medical assessment more challenging. Dr. Patel steadied himself against the cockpit wall while continuing his examination. Each bump felt magnified to Lee, every movement of the aircraft a reminder of her sole responsibility for their safety. She found herself talking under her breath, running through procedures like a mantra. Check altitude, scan instruments, monitor weather radar. It was something she'd seen Ray do during complicated approaches, though she'd never understood why until now. The familiar checklist patterns helped calm her racing thoughts. The sun had disappeared behind thick clouds, casting the cockpit in an eerie gray light. Warning indicators for the upcoming weather flickered on her display. Lee felt sweat trickling down her back as she calculated fuel reserves and alternate routes. The complexity of managing multiple emergency procedures simultaneously made her head spin. Time seemed to move strangely, stretching endlessly in some moments, rushing by in others. Each decision required immediate action, yet she felt frozen by the fear of making the wrong choice. The lives of everyone aboard hung on her ability to keep it together, to push past the panic threatening to overwhelm her. A sudden burst of turbulence shook the aircraft, and something in Lee's mind clicked. The endless spiral of anxious thoughts suddenly cleared, replaced by a strange sense of calm. She took a deep, deliberate breath, just like her first flight instructor had taught her years ago. One thing at a time, she whispered to herself, her grandmother's favorite saying coming back to her in this moment of crisis. Dr. Patel looked up from his examination of Captain Rage. "It appears to be a cardiac event," he said firmly. "He needs proper medical attention as soon as possible." The clarity of his diagnosis helped Lee focus. This wasn't just about her anymore. Every minute mattered for Rage's survival. She reached for the radio with steadier hands now. "Denver Center, Flight 247. We need priority handling for a medical emergency. Captain has experienced a possible heart attack." Her voice came out stronger than she expected, surprising even herself. The controller's response was immediate, offering multiple routing options around the weather. Mr. Singh had organized the cabin crew into an efficient emergency response team. One flight attendant was keeping detailed notes of the captain's vital signs, while another maintained a reassuring presence in the passenger cabin. Through the cockpit door, Lee could hear someone distracting nervous passengers by sharing interesting facts about the mountains below. The weather radar still showed threatening storms, but now Lee saw them differently. Instead of an overwhelming wall of red and yellow, she began identifying possible paths between the cells. Her training kicked in properly, not just the memorized procedures, but the actual understanding behind them. "Doctor," she called over her shoulder, "how long do we have?" Dr. Patel checked Raj's pulse again. "He's stable for now, but the sooner we land, the better." Lee nodded, pulling up detailed weather reports from nearby airports on her display. The information that had seemed overwhelming before now formed a clear pattern in her mind. A memory flashed through her head, Raj just that morning, pointing out the weather patterns over the Rockies. "Sometimes the best path isn't the most obvious one," he'd said. Looking at the radar now, she understood exactly what he meant. A slight deviation south would take them around the worst of the weather while keeping them close to suitable emergency airports. The airplane's subtle movements felt more natural now under her hands. She'd flown this route dozens of times as co-pilot, but this was different. Every small adjustment, every radio call, every decision came from a place of growing confidence rather than fear. "Ladies and gentlemen," she spoke into the passenger address system, surprising herself with her steady tone, "this is First Officer Lee. We're dealing with a medical situation and will be landing earlier than planned. Please remain calm and follow all crew instructions." The professionalism in her voice helped settle the murmur of concerned voices in the cabin. Air traffic control coordinated with nearby airports, offering weather updates and emergency services information. Lee processed it all with newfound clarity, her mind finally working with the situation instead of against it. She even found herself thinking several steps ahead, planning their approach while monitoring Raj's condition. Mr. Singh returned to the cockpit with an update on passenger conditions. An off-duty nurse had joined Dr. Patel in monitoring the captain, and families with children were being kept calm with extra attention from the crew. The practiced smoothness of the emergency response reminded Lee that she wasn't alone in this crisis. Through the cockpit window, breaks in the clouds revealed patches of sunlight dancing across the mountains. The same view that had seemed threatening earlier now offered hope. Beyond those peaks lay several airports, each a potential safe haven. Lee felt the weight of command settling onto her shoulders, not as a burden now, but as a responsibility she was ready to bear. Time seemed to move differently as Lee studied the navigation display, weighing her options. Salt Lake City was 45 minutes to the south, a major airport with excellent medical facilities. Cheyenne was closer but smaller, with limited emergency services. Each choice carried its own risks and benefits, and the responsibility of this decision pressed heavily on her mind. His blood pressures rising again, Dr. Patel reported from beside Captain Raj, his voice carrying a note of concern. The words made Lee's stomach tighten. Every minute they spent in the air was another minute Raj went without proper medical care. She thought of his daughter waiting at home, probably rehearsing her lines for the school play, unaware that her father's life hung in the balance. The weather radar painted a complex picture. A line of thunderstorms was building between them and Salt Lake City, while patches of clear air showed a potentially smooth route to Cheyenne. The fuel gauge showed plenty of reserves for either option, but the approaching weather system threatened to close off their choices if she delayed too long. Denver Center, Lee keyed her radio, requesting latest weather for both Salt Lake and Cheyenne. As she waited for the response, her eyes caught the family photo taped to Raj's side of the cockpit. His daughter in her school uniform, both of them smiling. The sight strengthened her resolve to make the right choice. Mr. Singh appeared at the cockpit door with an update. Passengers are calm, but we should decide soon. The turbulence is making some people nervous. He didn't need to mention that the bumpy air was also making it harder for Dr. Patel to monitor Raj's condition. The controller's voice crackled back with the weather report. Salt Lake was reporting deteriorating conditions, dropping ceilings and gusty winds. Cheyenne looked better weather-wise, but Lee knew their medical facilities weren't as comprehensive. She found herself wishing Raj was awake to offer his experienced advice. A burst of moderate turbulence rattled the aircraft, causing Dr. Patel to brace himself against the cockpit wall. "We need to get him stable ground treatment within the next hour," he advised, adjusting the oxygen mask on Raj's face. "The longer we wait, the riskier it becomes." Lee pulled up the approach charts for both airports on her tablet. Salt Lake's longer runways and better emergency response resources were appealing, but those approaching storms could mean a rough ride, dangerous for both Raj's condition and passenger safety. The shorter flight to Cheyenne would mean quicker medical attention, even if at a smaller facility. "What would you do, Captain?" she whispered, glancing at Raj's unconscious form. In her 8 months of flying with him, she'd seen him make countless decisions that seemed to balance all factors perfectly. Now she needed to find that same wisdom within herself. The radio crackled again with an urgent update. The storm system was intensifying faster than predicted, with reports of severe turbulence at multiple altitudes along the Salt Lake route. Lee's hand hovered over the radio switch as she processed this new information. Years of training had taught her that sometimes the perfect solution isn't available, you have to work with what you have. She thought about the 157 souls on board, each trusting her to make the right call. The passengers with children, the elderly couples, the business travelers, all their lives temporarily in her hands. And Raj, whose best chance depended on her decision in this moment. Taking a deep breath, Lee straightened in her seat. The choice crystallized in her mind, clear as the patches of sky between the storm cells on her weather radar. She reached for the radio, ready to commit to her decision. Sometimes, she realized, the best decision isn't the perfect one, but the one you can execute safely and confidently. Lee's voice was firm as she made the call. "Denver Center, Flight 247 requesting immediate diversion to Salt Lake City." Despite the weather challenges, she knew the superior medical facilities could make the difference for Captain Raj. The controller quickly cleared them for the new routing, and Lee felt a wave of certainty that she'd made the right choice. The next 45 minutes tested every bit of her training and newfound confidence. Threading between massive storm cells, the aircraft occasionally shuddered in the turbulent air. Lee kept the descent smooth, constantly adjusting their path based on the weather radar's warnings. Each mile brought fresh challenges, but also brought them closer to safety. Dr. Patel remained by Raj's side, providing regular updates. Blood pressure holding steady, he reported, his calm voice a reassuring presence in the cockpit. The medical team at Salt Lake City was already preparing for their arrival, briefed on Raj's condition through radio updates from the ground controller. In the passenger cabin, Mr. Singh's crew performed magnificently, keeping everyone calm through the occasional rough patches. They distributed water and reassured nervous travelers, turning a potential panic situation into a demonstration of professional crisis management. Some passengers even helped comfort a young mother with a crying baby, showing how emergencies could bring out the best in people. The storm clouds loomed ahead like dark mountains, but Lee had found her rhythm now. Each course correction felt natural, each radio call confident. She remembered Raj telling her once that flying wasn't about avoiding all problems, but about finding the safest path through them. Now she truly understood what he meant. Salt Lake City's approach controller guided them between the worst of the weather cells. Flight 247, descend and maintain 8,000 feet. Emergency services standing by. The city's lights began to appear through breaks in the clouds, a welcome sight after the darkness of the storm. The landing would be tricky, gusty crosswinds and rain made sure of that. But Lee felt strangely calm as she began the approach. All her years of training, all those hours in simulators, had prepared her for this moment. She could almost hear Raj's voice from their training sessions. Trust your instruments, trust your training, trust yourself. At 1,000 feet, the runway lights pierced through the rain. Lee's hands moved smoothly over the controls, adjusting for the crosswind. The passengers sat in tense silence, feeling the aircraft's movements but unaware of the precise dance Lee was performing with the elements. The touchdown was firm but perfectly controlled, exactly what was needed in the poor weather conditions. As they rolled down the runway, Lee could see the flashing lights of emergency vehicles already approaching the aircraft. A perfect orchestration of airport services, ready to help. Medical teams rushed aboard as soon as the aircraft reached the gate. Dr. Patel briefed them quickly while they transferred Raj onto a stretcher. Lee watched from the cockpit, her heart racing now that the immediate crisis was over. The passengers broke into spontaneous applause as the medical team efficiently moved Raj off the plane. 3 days later, Lee visited Raj in the hospital. He was sitting up in bed, color back in his face, his daughter curled up beside him reading her play script. "You picked Salt Lake City," he said with a knowing smile. "Longer route, better facilities. Good choice." Coming from him, those simple words meant everything. The incident changed both their lives. Raj recovered fully thanks to the quick medical response, and Lee discovered a strength within herself she hadn't known existed. In the years that followed, their story became a teaching tool in pilot training programs, showing how good decisions under pressure could make the difference between disaster and salvation. But perhaps the most meaningful moment came 6 months later, when Raj's daughter finally got to perform her play. She had insisted on waiting until her father was well enough to attend. Lee sat in the audience next to her former captain, watching the young girl play her part as a mighty tree bending but not breaking in the storm, a metaphor that now held special meaning for them both.